Hey everyone, thanks for joining me in this section. In this section, we're going to put that intro to Vault in our rear view mirror here, and we are going to set our sights on comparing authentication methods. Now, in this section, we're going to talk all about auth methods for Vault. So we're going to talk about how to enable them, how to configure them, and also how to use them. So it's going to be very important when we start interacting with Vault to really understand authentication methods. So let's jump in and let's talk about the objectives that we're going to have in this section. The first objective is describe auth methods. So in this objective, we're going to have a brief introduction to auth methods, and we'll talk about all the terms and all those kind of things that really focus on auth methods in Vault. We'll walk through an authentication workflow so you better understand how this workflow happens when you go to Vault and you provide your credentials to Vault and ultimately you obtain a token. We'll talk about what happens between when you initialize that connectivity and then you ultimately get your token at the end. And finally, in this objective, we'll talk about entities and groups. We'll talk about what they are and why they're important. Moving on over to objective 1B here. Objective 1B is choose an auth method based on the use case. So we'll talk about different use cases that I see when working with customers. We're thinking about things like automation, cloud-based requests, human users going to the UI or the CLI, and how do we choose a proper authentication method based upon all these use cases. And finally, we'll jump over to objective 1C here. And objective 1C is differentiate human versus system auth methods. So we're going to talk through all the different auth methods here, but what's really important about this objective is that based upon the use case and based upon who is actually authenticating to Vault, we are going to dictate which auth method is going to be better for that particular access. So if we have humans or regular users, you and I, that are accessing Vault, which auth method should we choose? If we have workloads running on a public cloud like AWS, Azure, GCP, which method is best when we have these cloud-based requests coming into Vault? And finally, we'll just talk about general machine-to-machine access. Doesn't necessarily have to be in the cloud. It can be on premises. It can be hybrid if you have maybe machines and Vault is running up in AWS, or vice versa. If you're running Vault on premises and you have cloud-based machines that need to access Vault, which auth method should we choose for that? So overall, this is the objective for this section. We're going to dive deep into all of these, and I'm going to provide you with a lot of different information throughout this section. And I want to make sure I'm going to be touching on a lot of the things that I see from users over the last 4.5 years of working with Vault. I'm going to make sure I want to answer all those questions for you. So let's jump in and start learning all about auth methods. All right, so let's jump back into our analogy that we had in the intro section around the hotel and how that compares to Vault. So again, just as a quick reminder, when we go to a hotel, we're going to go to this hotel reception and we are going to check in. When we ask to check in, the receptionist is going to ask if they can validate our ID, and we're going to provide them with a driver's license or some national identity card, depending on where you live, to prove who you say you are. So when we give that card to the receptionist, they're going to validate that it is a valid identity. So it's going to prove that you are who you say you are. Now, once this hotel receptionist has validated your credentials, they're going to turn around and give you an access key. So in a hotel, it's going to be a room key. In Vault, it's going to be a token. And again, this hotel key is going to be valid for a set number of days. Maybe it's 1 day, maybe it's 3 days, maybe it's a full week, maybe if you're on vacation. So this access card is going to be valid for that specific time. And of course, like we mentioned before, that card is going to give you access to all the amenities in the hotel. Remember, we talked about before that every time you need to use your card, you don't need to go back to reception and validate your identity. They do it once, they give you the token, and you start to use the token to do other things within the property. And the same thing with Vault. Once you get a token in Vault, then you can use that token to continuously request credentials, manage Vault, make changes in Vault, all those kind of things. All right, let's talk specifically around auth methods. So, what are auth methods in Vault? Well, auth methods are really Vault components that perform authentication and manage identities. And again, we're going to talk about identities as well in this section. Now, auth methods are really responsible for assigning identity and policies to a user, and it really does that through a token. When you authenticate into Vault, you're going to get that token. You're going to have an identity that's associated with your user, and then that token is going to have a policy attached to it that dictates what you can and cannot do within Vault. Now, when you're working with Vault, you can absolutely have multiple authentication methods enabled, just depending on your use case. Now, as I mentioned before, auth methods can be differentiated by human versus system methods. And so it just depends on your organization and your use cases on which authentication methods to use and really how many to use. Now, once you are authenticated to Vault through an auth method, Vault will issue that client token that we talked about, and you will use that to make all subsequent requests to Vault, whether that's a read, a write, a list, a delete, it doesn't matter. You're going to use that token over and over again until it expires. Remember that the fundamental goal of all auth methods is really to obtain a token. Now, each token has that associated policies and it has that TTL. So again, if you go back to our hotel analogy, we get that token, it has a policy that dictates what you can do, and it also has the time to live, how long it is valid. So I just wanted to make sure that you fully understand here the fundamental goal of an auth method is really to obtain a Vault token. So I always see some confusion around auth methods, but ultimately any auth method that you use, with the exception of the token, if you already have a token, but if you're using any other auth method within Vault, the absolute goal, the fundamental goal is to get a Vault token so you can use that Vault token to do other things. So again, our future requests to Vault will be made using that resulting token of our authentication. Now, talking about tokens, tokens are really the core method for authentication within Vault. Sure, we can enable LDAP and we can enable OIDC and AWS authentication in Azure and username and password, all those kind of things. But again, the fundamental goals of all those other ancillary auth methods is to obtain a token, and then you're going to use that token to do everything else. So the token auth method within Vault, it's responsible for creating and storing all those tokens. So when you log into Vault for the very first time, you are going to see the token auth method enabled. And no, you cannot disable that, because if for some reason you could, you would totally break Vault, all right? Because everything inside of Vault relies on these tokens. And again, real quick, authenticating with an external identity, LDAP, OIDC, AWS, doesn't matter. It will generate a token. Now, we're not going to go super deep into tokens because there is a specific objective in this course on tokens, and that is objective 3. So once you get to objective 3, we're going to go much deeper into Vault tokens. So the last thing I wanted to touch on here, if you do not supply a token for non-authenticated requests, meaning you go to Vault and say, I want to read a secret, or you go to Vault and say, I want to change something in Vault. I want to maybe enable an auth method or a secrets engine, or I want to go make changes to the audit log or things like that. So if you do not supply a token for those types of requests, Vault does not redirect you for authentication. There are no hints, there's no suggestions. Basically, Vault will say, nope, sorry, you get a 403 access denied error, and that's it. Vault's done. Right? It's not going to help you out. So again, if you are not authenticating to Vault and you don't provide that token, you're just going to get this 403 access denied error. So something to think about here. So just know that anytime you make a request that is non-authentication request, and what I mean by that is if you're authenticating, you're going to Vault and saying, hey, here's my username and password, give me a token, or here are my LDAP credentials. Obviously, you don't need a token for those types of requests because you're trying to get a token. So anytime you're making non-authentication requests, that's what I mean by that. That's when you'll get a 403 access denied error if you don't provide a token or you don't provide a valid token. All right, so let's take a look at the auth method workflow here. So of course, we have Vault and we have our end users, or it could be applications if we're interacting with the API. Doesn't really matter here. We've got some Vault client. Now, this Vault client needs to access Vault. And so this Vault client is going to make a request to Vault, and it's going to provide credentials. It's going to try to authenticate using credentials that it has to Vault. Now, Vault is going to use those credentials, and it's going to validate those credentials against the backend provider. So it could be something like LDAP, it could be AWS, it could be even its internal username and password database. It doesn't really matter. It's going to validate that those credentials are good. All right, so once we validated the credentials against the provider, Vault is going to generate a Vault token and it's going to attach a policy to that token. It's also going to attach a TTL to that policy as well. So, how long is this token valid for? Now, once it's done that, it's going to pass that token back to the requester here, our Vault client. It's going to return that token to the user. All right, so once the Vault client actually gets that token back from Vault, then that end user or application can use that token in order to access secrets in Vault. Now, again, I've got an infinity symbol there, and basically that means that as long as that token is valid, the client can continue using that token over and over until that token actually expires. So, for example, if that Vault token happens to have a 24-hour TTL, then the Vault client can actually use that Vault token as many times as it wants to grab secrets or manage vaults or do whatever, as many requests as it wants until that Vault token actually expires. So for this example, maybe the end user made a request to Vault for some credentials, and then Vault passed back this username and password that you see over here on the left. So hopefully this quick workflow allows you to better understand how an end user or an application goes from authenticating to Vault on the front end to actually retrieving a token on the back end and then ultimately using that token to make subsequent requests over to Vault. All right, so when we're talking about auth methods, there's a lot of different auth methods. So if you are using a lot of these different clouds or you have different technologies in your organization, most likely there's going to be an auth method that's going to fit your needs. And keep in mind that some of these auth methods are really geared towards human use, and some of these auth methods are geared towards machine to machine use. So if you think about something like an AWS, that's generally going to be an AWS machine, an AWS resource that can be an EC2 instance, that can be a Lambda function, something like that. That machine is going to authenticate to Vault using the AWS auth method. Now, if you look over on the right, we've got something like Okta. Okta is going to be more for human interaction. So when you log into Vault and you say, hey, I want to authenticate using Okta, it's going to redirect you and it's going to say, hey, go ahead and put in your username and password. And then more than likely, you're also going to get a push on your mobile phone for two-factor authentication. And once you've gone to your mobile app and you've said, yes, it's me, it's going to finish the authentication. It's going to pass Vault back the information. And Vault's going to say, cool, I know who you are. Here's your token with your associate policy and TTL. So this slide shows you an example of all of the authentication methods that are valid up to today. And I believe Vault is at 1.7 or 1.8. So it should be pretty up to date. All right, now that we know more about auth methods and Vault, let's talk about some specifics and working with these auth methods. Now, most of these auth methods must be enabled before you can actually use them. As we talked about before, the tokens auth method is already enabled when you first set up Vault, but that is the absolute only auth method that's enabled by default. If you want to use any of those other auth methods that we just saw in the last screen, then you're going to need to go enable it. You're going to need to configure it, and then you can actually consume that auth method. So again, one or many auth methods can be used at any given time, and generally different auth methods are used for different use cases. Now I've got app versus human on there, but you can also think about maybe different apps. Maybe you have some applications that are running on your public cloud platform, and it may make more sense to use the public cloud platform authentication method just so you don't have to provide those applications with any credentials. On the other hand, you may have some legacy apps that may need some credentials in order to interact with Vault. Maybe you have some applications that can't support interacting with Vault through an API or something like that, and you need to provide it with credentials directly in order to interact with Vault. So you have different authentication methods based upon those different use cases. Now, the token auth method, again, is enabled by default, and you cannot enable another token auth method, nor can you actually disable the token auth method. Now, new Vault deployments you always have that token for authentication. So if you have deployed Vault in the past and you know that the process is doing that Vault operator init, and then you get back the initial root token, again, that root token is been generated by the token auth method, and that is your absolute only method for authentication when you first stand up Vault. And again, that goes back to the reason is that the only method enabled is that token auth method. The idea is that you would use that root token in order to log into Vault and start enabling new auth methods. Maybe you're using LDAP internally and you want to set that up. So you'd log in as the root token, you would enable LDAP, you would set it up, and then ultimately you would get rid of that root token. Now, auth methods can be enabled or disabled and configured using all three of our Vault interfaces. So the UI, the API, or the CLI. Now, one thing to note that the UI isn't really fully featured like the CLI and API, so there may be things that you can't necessarily do in the UI. They are continually improving it though, and you can actually do a lot of stuff with auth methods in the UI now. So if you are used to using the user interface, go ahead and check that out. See if the auth method that you want to use is fully supported. If not, you may have to jump into the CLI or use that web browser CLI to run a command or two. Now, you must provide a valid token to enable, disable, or modify our auth methods in Vault. Now, when we need to make changes to the Vault platform itself, like enabling or disabling or modifying these auth methods, we have to have a valid token, and that token must also have the proper privileges in order to do those types of things that we need to do. So I just want to make that clear. When you are authenticating to Vault for the first time, you do not need a token. When you are making changes to an actual auth method, then you will absolutely need a token. Now, each auth method, when you enable it, is enabled at a path. We talked about paths in the intro, and we talked about the fact that everything in Vault is path-based. So it should come as no surprise that when you enable an auth method, and actually when you enable a secrets engine or audit device or any of those kind of things, they are enabled at a specific path. Now you can choose the path name when, and really only when, you enable the auth method. And I put that in there because you cannot change the path name once you actually enable it. If you need to change the path name, you're generally going to disable that auth method and you're going to re-enable it using the new name. Now, if you don't provide a name when you enable a auth method, the auth method will actually be enabled at its default path. And this default path is always equal to the type of the auth method. So for example, if you are enabling the AWS auth method and you do not provide it with a custom name, the auth method is going to be mounted at the name AWS. The other example is app role. If you enable the app role auth method and you do not provide it with a custom name, it's going to be mounted at the default name of app role. So just like here on the bottom terminal, I went into Vault and said Vault auth enable app role, and it says cool, I enabled app role at the path of app role. All right, and we'll go into a little bit more on that stuff shortly. All right, so how do we start working and interacting with all these auth methods now that we fully understand how they all work? Well, the first method that I wanted to go through is using the command line interface. Now, this is generally what I will use when I'm working with Vault, but again, I know that everybody may not necessarily be comfortable with the command line, so you may be more of a UI person or you may be interacting using the API. It doesn't really matter. We're going to be able to do the majority of these things regardless of which interface we're going to use. But in this case, we're going to talk about the CLI. So when we're interacting with auth methods, we're going to use the vault auth command. And we have quite a few subcommands that we can use with our vault auth command. Now, the first one is enable, and well, that should tell you that we want to enable a new auth method. So the example over here, as we saw before, vault auth enable and app role. And it says, hey, cool. It says, all right, success. We've enabled app role auth method at the path of app role. Now, the next one is disable. So vault auth disable. That should be pretty obvious that we want to disable an auth method. So the way we use that is vault auth disable, and then we say app role. Now, in this case, app role in the purple here is the name of the mount that we want to disable. It's not the type that we want to disable. So for example, if I enabled app role at the mount of Brian, I would say vault auth disable Brian, just to make sure that's clear. Now we can also do vault auth list, and that's an easy way to quickly determine which auth methods are enabled on a specific vault cluster. So in this case, I did a vault auth list, and you can see that I have a path of Brian, and that's a type of app role that I've enabled on this cluster. You can see our default token auth method enabled here at the path of token. And finally, you can see I've enabled another app role auth method at the path called vault-course. Now, the other two commands I have on here, tune. Now, you'll use tune in order to modify the auth method as a whole. Sometimes you'll use tune in order to modify things like the default TTL to the auth method. So by default is going to grab the vault default TTL. And if you say, hey, maybe I want this auth method, the max TTL to be 1 hour, you can use vault auth tune in order to do that. Now, vault auth help should be familiar because we kind of went through that in the CLI back in the intro. But if you do vault auth help command, it's going to show you information about how to use the vault auth command. All right, so when we want to enable an auth method using the CLI, and we want to enable an auth method at the default path, we can just say vault auth enable and then the type of the auth method that we want to enable. In this case, I used app role. So it says success. I enabled app role auth method at the path of app role. But what if we want to give it a custom name like we saw before in the previous slide? What if I want to enable an auth method using my custom path? So in this case, I would say vault auth enable, right? That should look familiar. But in this case, we're going to throw in an argument here. We're going to say path equals, and we're going to provide it with our custom path name. And then finally, at the end here, we're going to give it the type of the auth method that we want to enable. So in this case, in the yellow here, we are enabling an app role auth method, but we want to enable it at the path of vault-course. So you can see that at the bottom here, success enabled app role auth method at the path of vault-course. So hopefully that is clear. So if you are looking for more specifics about working with the Vault CLI, there's going to be a lot more in depth in Objective 6 in this course. So I just wanted to provide enough information in this section so you understand how to work with auth methods using the CLI, but we're going to dive a lot deeper in Objective 6. All right, so let's break down some of these commands so you fully understand it when you're working with the Vault CLI. So again, we've got our command vault auth enable app role. So vault, of course, is going to be our command that we use when we're working with Vault in general. Now, when we say vault auth, now the auth piece in this command is the type of vault object that you want to work with. You'll see later on down the road when we get to things like secrets engines and audit devices and other components of vaults, that's going to be the type of object we want to work with as the second part of our command. So later on down the road, we may have things like vault secrets or vault audit or things like that. In this case, since we're working with auth methods, we're going to say vault auth. Now we have our subcommand. After that, we just saw all those commands a minute ago. We had enable, disable, list, tune, and help. So in this case, we're going to enable it. And at the end here in the yellow, we have the type of the auth method. Now, again, we just talked about the fact that we just run this command. We're going to enable the app role auth method on the default path of app role, which that's cool. I do that a lot. That's fine, no problem. But just know that in this case, app role defines the type of auth method. So if we break this out just a little bit more, we saw this command before as well. Vault auth enable, we have path equals apps, and we have app role. So again, auth is the type of vault object we want to work with. We have the subcommand of enable. And now in blue here, we're saying, hey, this is an argument that we can use to customize the path name of our mount. So that's where the blue piece comes in. We have path equals apps. And again, on the far right in yellow, we have the type of the auth method. So again, this is going to enable an app role auth method at the path of apps. If we break it out just a little bit more, I wanted to show you that you can also add a description to this. So vault auth enable path equals apps, description equals my apps, and then we've got the type of app role. So of course we added the description in here, and the description is something you can see when you do a vault auth list. If it shows you in table form, it'll actually show you the description right there. So if that's important to you, make sure you throw a description in there as well. All right, so if we want to disable an auth method, very similar to how we just did it, in this case, vault auth disable apps. Notice again that we have disable as our sub command because that's what we want to do with an auth method. But notice on the right, now we have apps. Again, when we're disabling, you have to specify the path of the object to be disabled. Before we said enable and we said app role, but we had a path of apps. What we need to do when we disable is provide the path of the object to be disabled. So if we enabled a vault auth method at the path of apps, and now we want to disable it, we would just tell Vault, hey, vault auth disable apps, and Vault is going to take care of it for us. All right, so now that you know a little bit more about working with an auth method, things like enabling or disabling an auth method, once an auth method has been enabled in Vault, we're going to use the auth prefix in order to configure and interact with our auth method. So the syntax for this is going to be vault right. In this case, we're going to make a change to our auth method. So we're going to say vault right, and we're going to say auth slash, and then we're going to specify the path name of our auth method, and then we're going to provide it with the options after that. So the example down here is vault right auth. That's our prefix. App role is going to be the mount name of our auth method. So in this case, we just kept it as the default of app role. And then we have our other options. So in this case, we're going to write a configuration to auth, app role, role, and vault course. So in this case, we're going to create a new role in app role called vault course, and we're going to provide it with details such as the secret ID TTL, the number of token uses, the TTL of those tokens, the max TTL, and the number of uses for the secret ID. So in this case, we're creating a role specifically for app role. And we don't need to go super deep into app role. That's not necessarily the point of this slide here, but just know that anytime you're interacting with an auth method, after it has been enabled, you're going to prefix it with an auth slash and then that path. So before we enabled an auth method on the apps mount, we would do vault right auth slash apps slash role slash whatever. So just want to make sure that that's clear. So now what we're going to do is jump into a quick demo, and we're going to walk through a lot of this stuff and interacting with the auth method using the Vault CLI. Hey everyone, welcome to this lab where we are going to walk through a lot of the concepts that we just went through in the lecture. However, we're going to do it in this lab. So we're going to walk through configuring auth methods using the CLI. So on my screen here, I have a session open to one of my Vault nodes here, and we're going to walk through the CLI commands that we would use when we're interfacing with our Vault auth methods. In the lecture, we talked about how we would use the vault auth command when we are interacting with any of our auth methods. So if you do a -h here, we're going to get a lot of information about our vault auth methods. We're going to get examples of how to use the vault auth command. We're also going to get a list of our subcommands that we went over earlier and some additional detailed information to help you along the way. So I'm going to clear the screen there. And again, let's start enabling some auth methods. So the first thing I'm going to do is do vault auth, and we'll type in enable. Remember, that's going to be our command when we're going to enable or create a new auth method. And in this case, let's just use user pass. So again, as we talked about in the lecture, vault auth is the type of the component that we want to work with in Vault. We're going to enable it. It's kind of our verb here. And then user pass, again, remember, that's the type of the auth method that we want to enable. So if we hit enter on that, you can see that Vault does enable a user pass auth method on the default pass of user pass. So if we do a Vault auth list here, you can see that we have our default auth method of token, but now we also have our new user pass auth method that we just added. But what if we want to enable this user pass auth method on a different path? Well, we went through that in the lecture. Let's do it here. Vault auth enable. And remember, we're going to do path equals, and let's just call it vault course. And then at the end, remember, we're still going to add the type of the auth method that we want to add. So we're going to type in user pass here. If we hit enter there, Cool. It says we enabled the user pass auth method, but we enabled it at the path of vault-course. So again, if we do a vault auth list, we should be able to see our token. We can see the original user pass auth method that we enabled before. And now we can see the new one that we just created under the path of vault-course. All right, so what if we don't like that? What if we don't like the original one that we created and we want to just move forward with the one that's called vault course? Well, we can get rid of that original one by just saying vault auth disable. And remember, at this point, we are going to refer to the path name. And we enable this at the default path name of user pass. So we enter here. All right, so we disable the auth method at the path of user pass. Again, if we do vault auth list here, we can see that now we just have the default auth method of token. And now we have our custom user pass mounted at vault-course. So pretty easy. Now let's go ahead and add a description to that. Unfortunately, you can't really add a description after it has already been created. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and disable vault-course. So now we shouldn't have any auth methods enabled except for our tokens. So there we are. So let's go ahead and do vault auth enable. And we'll say path equals there, and then I don't know, just call it Brian. And then what we'll do is we'll add a description here. We'll say local credentials for, if I can't spell, for vault. And then remember, at the end of this, we still need to provide the type of the auth method that we want. So again, we'll type in user pass here. All right, cool. So we enabled user pass at auth method Brian, again, vault auth list. And now we have our path as Brian. Remember, it's type user pass. And notice now we actually have our description that we added. So just in case you want to add a description, that's how you would do it. Now, a couple other things that we talked about vault auth enable. We already did a vault auth disable. We already showed you vault auth list. The other thing we can do is a vault auth tune here. And remember, you can use tune in order to modify the configuration of a particular auth method. So what we can do is we can say vault auth tune, and maybe we want to set the default lease for this particular auth method to, I don't know, let's just say 24 hours. And then we would call out the path name. So in this case, is going to be Brian. Oh, we need to do default lease. Sorry about that. -TTL. There we go. All right. So now we just tuned the auth method of Brian, which is a user pass. So anytime we get a token from that user pass, anytime we authenticate using the user pass Brian and we get a token, the default TTL for that token will now be 24 hours rather than using the default vault TTL. All right, so now that we've got the user pass enabled, the other thing I want to do is just show you how to configure some of the user pass. Now, we're not necessarily focused on user pass in this lab, but I want to show you how you can start interacting with a particular auth method. So what we're going to do is maybe create a user for our user pass. So we'll say vault write because we're going to write a new configuration. And remember, we talked about that anytime you enable an auth method and you start interacting with that auth method, we're going to add that auth prefix, and then we're going to add the path name of the auth method that we are interacting with. In this case, I'm going to create a user, and let's create a user called, I guess, Krausen, and then the password, we'll just say the password is vault, and we'll say the policies is Brian. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying vault write a configuration. It doesn't have to be a new one, but we're going to write a configuration. We're going to work with an auth method. The auth method that we want to use is mounted at the path of Brian. And beyond the user pass auth method, we have additional options such as creating users. And this is the specific path that we would use when we want to create a user. Now, this right here is the name of our user. So if your name is Bob or Tim or Sam or whatever, and that's the username that you want to create, you would replace it here instead of my last name. You provide it with the password that you want. Of course, make it much more complicated than just vault. And then finally, you can assign one or more policies to your user by specifying them here. So we hit enter here. we create a new user. Now, when we are working with auth methods again, if you want to start listing some of these things out, we know that the proper path for users is right here, auth/Brian/users. So we want to see what users are out there. We can just say vault list auth Brian users. It should show you a list of users. And of course, we just have one out here. If we want to actually read this particular user to see what configuration it may have, we can say vault read auth Brian users and then the username here. We hit enter there to show you information about that specific user. Now, this is very similar regardless of which auth method that you're working with. Remember, each different auth method is going to have different parameters or configurations that you're going to use as you're using this auth method. So for example, if you're using app role, you're going to create roles. And then underneath that role, you can go and grab the secret ID, you can go grab the role ID, and then you can use that for authentication. So I'll give you a quick example of that one before we wrap up the lab here. So let's go ahead and enable app role. So vault auth enable app role. We'll just keep it at the default path. So if we wanted to create a new role, we would say vault right. And again, that auth prefix, app role is the path name. In this case, we're going to create a role, and maybe the role is Brian. And then we can also provide it with additional information, maybe the token TTL equals 20 minutes. And maybe the policy that we want attached to it is our policy named Brian. So we enter there and we just created a new role. Again, notice that before when we were working with the user pass, our path was auth and then the path name and then users, because users is something associated with the user pass. But when we're working with app role, we have auth and of course our path name, and we have role because roles are something that's associated with the app role auth method. So just be wary that each different auth method may have additional features beyond the specific path when you enable it. Some will have a configuration, some will have roles, some will have users. Again, it just depends on which auth method that you're using. So hopefully that clears up a lot of stuff. If you had any doubts on some of the content that we went through, and hopefully showing it in a lab helps solidify a lot of the material that we walked through. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, in this lab, we are going to configure an auth method using the Vault API. Now on the screen here, I have a session open to my Vault cluster here. And what we're gonna do is go ahead and use the curl command to send API requests to our Vault server and go ahead and enable the app role auth method. So what we need to start off with is a curl command, and we're gonna provide the header. Remember, when you are configuring, enabling, or disabling auth methods, in Vault, you need to have a valid token that has those properties already. So in this case, I'm going to provide the X Vault token header, and I'm going to go ahead and add my token in here. And this is going to be a post, this request type. All right, and so now what we need to do is add the data. So we do dash dash data, and I'm going to provide the type of the auth method as a file, and I called it auth.json. And the only thing in there is basically says the type equals app role. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And then finally, we're going to call out the API endpoint. So HTTP, again, I am running Vault locally. So 8200 here, got a line feed. That's all right. Keep on going here. v1/auth. Oh, sorry. This is going to be sys because we haven't enabled it yet. Sys auth app role. So if we hit enter here, we should now enable our auth method. So let's go ahead and check it out. I also have the Vault CLI here, and we're logged in, Vault auth list, and now we have our app role enabled. All right, so now that we have our auth method enabled, what we need to go do is we need to start creating a role. So we can do that using the API as well. So I'm going to say curl, and I'm going to do a header again, and we're going to provide our X Vault token. Again, we're going to provide that same one. Now in this case, we're going to do a request is going to be a post again. And the data I'm going to provide in another file called policies. And this is just a file that basically says the policy equals Brian. That's the policy we've been working with throughout the lab so far. And then finally, we need to call out our HTTP API endpoint here. So 127.0.0.1 8200/v1. In this case, we're going to do auth because we're working directly with an auth method, app role, and let's just call it vault course. All right, so go ahead and hit enter there. So now we have created a new app role. And what we need to do is now fetch the role ID as we did before in the CLI. So in order to do that, we can just do a curl. We can do header again and our X vault token. Provide that, and we'll just call out the API endpoint. So 127.0.0.1, and this is going to be auth/app role. So we're going to kind of walk through it just like we did in the CLI. The role is going to be vault course. That's what we named it, and we are trying to fetch the role ID. So if we hit enter, we get the response here. If we do that again and pipe that to JQ so it's a lot easier to read, we can see under the data column here, we have our role ID right here. Now we could go do the same thing for our secret ID if we want to. It could be a little bit different. So we'll clear the screen here. So again, start with our curl command. Actually, what I'm gonna do is just hit up and I'm gonna cheat. So save a little bit of time here. And we're just gonna update our API endpoint here. So now we're just going to say secret-ID. We'll make sure that it is a post. Oh, sorry about that. Let's go back to secret-ID. And then what we're going to do is go back here and we're going to say we want to add another header. It's going to be request and it's going to be a post. So we hit enter there. We should get back a secret ID, maybe. Oh, missing client token. Okay, I see what I did. I messed that up. I added the header in the wrong place here. So let's just go ahead and put the header in the right place. There we go. All right, so we just grabbed a secret ID. We also piped that to JQ, just like we did before. And now you can see we actually have a secret ID from Vault. So now we have our role ID, we have our secret ID, and that was, of course, after we enabled our app role and we configured a new role. So hopefully that helps you understand a bit better how to use the API to start configuring our auth methods in HashiCorp Vault. Hey there, this is Brian, and welcome to this lab where we are going to look at configuring auth methods using the Vault UI. Now, I am going to go ahead and log in to my cluster here using Okta. So I'm going to select Okta. I'm going to go ahead and put in my credentials here. And I need to go copy my password. All right. So we are logged in. Now, once we're in, we can go and start enabling and configuring auth methods using the UI. Now, in order to do that, we're going to go up here to Access, and then we have a bunch of auth methods already enabled that we've worked through this course. So we want to enable a new one. We click on Enable New Method here, and we have our choice of which auth method that we want to enable. Now, in this case, let's just go ahead and choose username and password. So we're going to say Next. We're going to give it a name. Maybe we give it a name of Vault. We can choose these method options here, and we've got additional options. If we're running enterprise, we can enable seal wrap. We can modify the default TTL, maybe 30, let's say 30 minutes. And then the max TTL, maybe, I don't know, 24 hours if we want to. We can also select the token type. So if we want a batch token or a service token, we're going to leave it as the default here. But there's a lot of different things that we can go ahead and enable here. We can also give it a description. My cool new auth method. and then go ahead and hit enable method. Oh, say we have 5 minutes. There we go. Service token. Here we go, enable method. All right, so we have created a new user pass off method under the mount of Vault. So if we go back to access here, we can see our new one, which is right here at the bottom. We called it Vault, and you can see that it's user pass. It says user pass right here. If you click into here, you can actually start creating users. Now, I forget when they added this. It's a newer feature of the user pass auth method in the UI, but you can actually create users straight from the UI. So you can create a user, and let's just create a user called Bob. We can give them a password of Bob is cool. And then we can also drop this down and say tokens, and we can select the policy that we want to give those tokens. If you want to do more than one policy, you click add here. And maybe there's another policy called Krausen. I don't think there is, but we can save. Now we have a new user called Bob. His password is Bob is cool. And then he's also bound to these two policies, Brian and Krausen. Now, I don't think Krausen exists, so we may get an error on that. But if we wanted to, we can actually drop over to the CLI and we can actually use this to log in. So vault login method equals user pass. Username equals Bob, and then we give them the password. Bob is cool. So we're going to get an error because that doesn't exist. That policy doesn't exist. But anyway, I wanted to show you how you can create some of that stuff. Again, you go back to auth methods. If you want to disable an auth method, you just click on the little three dots here, and you can say disable and say, yes, we want to delete all the data, and it's gone. Same thing with this one, disable, gone. If you want to edit the configuration, we can click on here, say view, oh, that's the token, say view or edit the configuration here, and you can start giving it information about your auth method. So in this case, it's Azure. We can provide it with a tenant ID, resource environment, all those kind of things that are specific to the Azure auth method. So that's pretty much it for this lab. It's pretty easy to use and configure auth methods using the user interface. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks. All right, so now that we know how to enable and configure our auth methods using our primary interfaces, let's talk about how we start consuming these auth methods. Now that we have something enabled, how do we get a Vault client to go to Vault and obtain a token using some of these auth methods? Now we'll start off with the CLI first, but there are a few ways you can authenticate to Vault when we are actually using the CLI. Now, the first one is going to be probably the most common. It's the one I use probably the most, just if I'm just interacting with Vault directly, is I'll just use the Vault login command. Now, this will allow us to authenticate using a token or another auth method. So, for example, if we have a straight up token, we can just say Vault login, provide the token, and we're done. If we need to log in with using something like OIDC or LDAP or Okta or anything else, we would say vault login, and we would provide the method, and then we provide that data along with it. Now, when we use the vault login command, it actually makes use of what's called a token helper. And we'll talk a little bit more about token helpers in a few slides, but a token helper allows you to authenticate once to Vault, and then you can make all subsequent requests without having to authenticate every single time. It kind of goes back to our hotel analogy. We're going to authenticate, get our key card, and then we're going to be able to swipe that as many times as we want throughout the hotel. Same kind of concept here. Now, the other way to authenticate to Vault is if you already have a token, you can simply set the Vault token environment variable as your token, and then you can start just running commands against Vault. So that's another way you can easily authenticate to Vault just by providing that token and then start running commands. So let's take a look at the Vault login command here. So this example here, I already have a token. It's that s.fhnbot. That's our token. And I'm just going to say vault login and provide that token and hit enter. Now, by default, the vault login command actually uses the token method. So this works out perfect here. And if you read the response from Vault, it says success, you are now authenticated, blah, blah, blah. Notice it says you do not need to run vault login again. Future Vault requests will automatically use that token. And that goes back to the token helper that we talked about before. And I'm still going to go in a little bit detail as we go through this. But you can see down here in the table, we've got our token. You should see that token actually matches with that token that we just provided. We've got the token accessor, and we've got more information about this token. In this case, I'm actually using a root token in this example. And you can tell by the infinity symbol and the token duration, and the token policy is actually root. But what if we don't actually have a token already? The example here is I've enabled the user pass auth method, and I need to authenticate to Vault to obtain a token. I've got a username and password, but I need a token to do other things in Vault. So in this case, I can say Vault login method equals user pass. I can say username equals Brian, and I hit enter. It's going to say, hey, please provide your password. Type in the password, assuming that is correct. It's going to say, hey, cool, you are authenticated. Here is your token. So you can see down here in the blue, it says got a token. Just by providing it with my username and password, I got a token. Again, it kind of goes back to one of the very first things we talked about when we first started this lesson. The ultimate goal of auth methods is to obtain a token. In this case, I used the user pass auth method and I got a token. So it still kind of follows that same workflow there. All right, so let's break down that command line really quick. So again, we start with Vault. We have Vault login, which is our subcommand here. In this case, we're going to say the method that we want to use is the user pass, and the user pass is the type of the auth method used to authenticate. It's not going to be the path that we enabled it at. It's going to be the type of auth method that we're going to use. If we actually have multiple auth methods of, say, user pass, maybe one's enabled at user pass and one's enabled at Brian or something like that, there is another argument that you can provide in here as the path, and you can provide it which specific path that you want to use. But anyhow, this one says method equals user pass, and we say the username that we want to log in is Brian. That's our argument for passing additional data for Vault authentication. Again, when you hit enter, it's going to ask you for the password, and it's not going to echo that on the screen. So if you want more information about that, I've also posted a link down here. You can check out how you can use the Vault login command. All right, so let's step back real quick. And again, I promised you that we would go into the token helper. So the token helper is going to be a file that allows us to cache the token information after we authenticate. So what this does is actually stores the token in a local file so that it can be referenced for all your subsequent requests. So again, as we do a Vault login over here on the left, it's actually going to create a local file called .vault-token, and it's going to store that token in that file. It's just a text file. You can open it and easily see that. But anytime you log in, do a Vault login, it doesn't matter which auth method you're going to use, it's going to create that file. Then any subsequent requests using the Vault CLI after you authenticate are going to reference that file to provide the token for authentication for every command, so you don't actually have to provide it every time you run a command. Let's take a look at that workflow really quickly. So we've got our user in green here, makes their initial authentication over to Vault. Vault, of course, we know returns a token over to this user. Now, this user's laptop is going to create our token helper file. It's going to write our token to a .vault-token file, right, a helper file here. Now, if this user makes additional requests over to Vault, maybe a request for a secret, this user can just type in the command for the secret to retrieve the secret here. They don't necessarily have to include the token in that request. And what the Vault CLI will do is grab that token out of the Vault token file, append that to basically the API request over to Vault, and it's going to authenticate for you using that token. So again, by using this token helper file, you don't need to provide the token for every request that you make to Vault after that initial authentication. All right, so the last thing I want to touch on here, when you are using the Vault CLI, we talked about that you're going to get all this information back from Vault after you authenticate. Things like the token, the accessor, all the things related to the token, the policies, how long it's going to live for, those kind of things. Now, one thing that you can do is if you have machines that are going to interact and use the CLI for authentication for some reason versus the API, you can actually set the format to JSON, and this allows this to be more machine parsable. What we can do is easily parse this JSON response when we authenticate in order to actually obtain our Vault token. So the example down here is I'm going to export our vault ADDR. Then I'm going to export another environment variable, and that's going to be vault format equals JSON. So that's basically going to tell Vault, hey, every time you send a response back to me, go ahead and send that back in a JSON format. Now, the next one that starts with output is actually going to create a variable. It's going to set the value of that variable to the output of our login command. So in this case, we're going to say vault write auth app role login. We're going to provide it with a role ID and a secret ID. So in this case, we are authenticating to Vault using app role, and we're providing a role ID and a secret ID. So that response is going to be stored in the variable of output. Then what we're going to do is we're going to set our vault token environment variable equal to the token that we get from output. So what we're going to do is say vault token equals, and we're going to parse the output using JQ, and we're going to grab .auth.client token. And that's going to parse through that JSON. It's going to grab just our client token that we got included in the response from Vault. It's going to set that value as our Vault token. And then we can just say either Vault login and Vault token, or we can just run commands against Vault because now we have that token value set as our Vault token environment variable. So I just want to provide this quick and dirty kind of example of how you can actually parse the response from Vault using something like JQ, obtain just the client token, and then use that token for authentication or subsequent requests to Vault. So what we'll do now is jump back into the lab, and we're going to walk through how we start consuming some of these Vault auth methods using our Vault CLI.